In Inquiry on Human Understanding, which is David Hume's main philosophical treatise, the Scottish philosopher distinguishes between relations of ideas, which makes reference to Aristotelian logic and mathematics, namely the way in which a conclusion follows from a set of premises in a necessary and absolutely certain way, in the same fashion that, for example, 2 + 1 = 3, or in the way in which any mathematical theorem is deduced. It has absolute certainty. Relations of ideas, therefore, for Hume, are characterized by the absolute certainty with which conclusions follow premises, or with which mathematical relations are demonstrated. Now, Hume distinguishes between relations of ideas, which are marked by absolute certainty in the realm of logic and mathematics, but only strictly to those self-referenced systems, that is, to the theorems in mathematics and the syllogisms in logic. The matters of fact refer to all those phenomena and all those propositions outside of Aristotelian logic and mathematics. So, for example, David Hume takes the proposition "tomorrow the sun will rise" as an example of a proposition that is a matter of fact. And Hume makes the point, and here is the central element of his scepticism: the propositions which belong to what Hume calls matters of fact, like the proposition "tomorrow the sun will rise," don't have the same absolute certainty that a mathematical theorem or that a syllogism in logic has. So, for example, the syllogism "all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal," or, for example, the theorem that the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the square of the sum of the remaining two sides, or the axiom that all the angles within a triangle must add up in Euclidean geometry to 180 degrees. All of these propositions have absolute certainty, but the propositions that belong to what Hume calls matters of fact don't have that absolute certainty. The proposition "tomorrow the sun will rise" appears to have absolute certainty, so many people are tempted to think that the proposition "tomorrow the sun will rise" has the same absolute certainty that a mathematical theorem or that a syllogism in logic. However, the idea that the sun will rise tomorrow is what Hume calls a belief, and a belief is the consequence of a specific way in which the mind associates ideas derived from sense experience using three ways: causality, and Hume claims that causality, cause and effect, is not something that exists independently of the subject, but is something exclusive to the faculties of the subject. That is, the way in which the mind associates ideas derived from the different stimuli which the senses detect and accumulate in the context of experience, of sense experience. Contiguity in space and time, and lightness are the three ways in which Hume claims that the mind associates ideas which derive from sense experience. Hume claims that all knowledge derives from experience, and he shows in his main philosophical work on Inquiry on Human Understanding that even the most mystical, the most imaginative, the most surreal ideas, the most fantastic sounding images in literature and myth actually can be traced back to specific ideas which derive from sense experience. So, for example, Hume analyzes the image of a mountain of gold. That seems to be something beyond experience because we have never seen a mountain made of gold. However, the notion of a mountain of gold can be split into two separate ideas, which in turn can be traced to specific sense experiences. For example, the notion of mountain and the notion of gold can be traced respectively to the experience of gold and a mountain. The idea, the mythological idea of a centaur, likewise can be traced back to sense experience in the case of a horse and the case of a man. In the case of an angel or any other mythical creature, religious image or supernatural being in fantasy, in literature, they can all be traced to separate images or composite images which are the result of sense experience. So Hume claims that all propositions outside of Aristotelian logic and mathematics don't have absolute certainty, and that something like causality, the relationship between cause and effect, is not something that exists objectively, independently of the subject, but is one of the ways in which the mind associates ideas derived from sense experience. That is why the proposition "tomorrow the sun will rise" is not a proposition that has absolute certainty, that necessarily follows, like the conclusion from two correct premises in an Aristotelian syllogism, or the result of a theorem or axiom in mathematics, but that proposition is simply a belief, which is the result of a habit of association of the mind of specific ideas which derive from sense experience. So the mind has associated that the sun rises at a certain time, has associated those ideas derived from specific sense experiences, so that when those experiences are repeated, then the association is repeated and the proposition is thus repeated in a habit which leads to a belief, and that belief has the illusion of certainty, of certain knowledge, but in reality is simply a way in which the mind has accustomed itself to associate ideas derived from sense experience. David Hume's scepticism claims that there is no a priori knowledge because all knowledge derives from experience, and claims that there is no absolute certainty in matters of fact, that is, in everything that is outside of Aristotelian logic and mathematics. Kant claims that Hume woke him up from his dogmatic dream, and in his Critique of Pure Reason, Kant answers David Hume's scepticism by showing that even though all knowledge effectively derives from sense experience, there are a priori conditions to that knowledge, and that is what Kant calls the transcendental conditions of sensibility and understanding. In the transcendental aesthetics of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant is going to show how the two a priori or transcendental conditions that allow the senses to effectively gather information of the phenomena, remembering that Kant distinguishes between the thing in itself and the phenomenon. The phenomenon is created by the subject and the thing in itself is unknowable. So in the transcendental aesthetics, Kant shows that the two a priori conditions of experience are time and space. Time and space, however, are not time and space in themselves, the thing in itself, because everything in itself, making abstraction of the subject and his faculties of understanding and sensibility, simply is unknowable. So the two a priori conditions that make sense experience possible are time and space. They are the pure intuitions of sense experience. In the transcendental analytic, Kant shows the 12 categories, which are the transcendental condition for the understanding, which allow the understanding to gather the intuitions which form sense experience. And together, sense experience and the understanding, due to those a priori conditions, they create phenomenon, they create the reality that we perceive. Anything beyond that reality is simply unknowable. Kant, in his Transcendental Dialectics, shows that all knowledge which attempts to go beyond sense experience is like that bird which thinks it can fly better in the absence of air resistance. Of course, the bird might think that in a vacuum it will fly better because it has no air resistance, but it is effectively due to the conflict between the movement of the wings of the bird and air resistance that flight is possible. So Kant takes this image in his Critique of Pure Reason and invites us to think that the bird is metaphysics and all that type of knowledge that tries to go beyond sense experience, and air resistance is the representation of air resistance. So metaphysics, like the bird, thinks that it can fly better, thinks that it can lead to a better understanding of reality by leaving behind sense experience, like the bird that wants to leave behind air resistance, thinking that it can fly better in a vacuum, but it turns out it can't fly. That is, it can't advance, it can't lead to a true, objective, certain scientific knowledge. All scientific knowledge, and the highest form of knowledge that we can aspire to, according to Kant, is scientific knowledge based within the limits of sense experience. When metaphysics tries to go beyond sense experience, it leads to paralogisms, to antinomies or contradictions, and to dogma.